And so, Don, with the enactment of the exclusion law in 1882, and what Justice Lowe said in terms of access to the federal courts, Chinese actually took advantage of that, and they hired good lawyers, and they brought cases challenging the Exclusion Act in courtrooms like this, using habeas corpus.
That's exactly what they did, and though Judge Lowe was talking about the Chinese turning to the federal courts for confirmation of some of their rights in the country, when it came to immigration, the federal courts were not very friendly at all. And as it happened, two of the cases involving the Chinese exclusion laws, probably no other case that reached the Supreme Court, no other cases that have reached the Supreme Court have had as profound an effect upon the system of immigration law that we followed in the United States ever since. These were two cases involving the Chinese exclusion laws. And I say there were unfortunate consequences that came up as a result of those cases, because those cases led to something that was called the Plenary Power Doctrine, that is, the authority of the United States acting through the Congress to decide who can enter the United States and who can live in the United States, and provided for their exclusion and for their deportation. The two cases that came up involving the Chinese exclusion laws both involved immigrants who were living in this country perfectly lawfully. They had come into the country prior to the enactment of the Chinese exclusion laws, and they were entitled to live here. One of them lived right here in San Francisco, and he decided at a certain point that he was going to make a trip back to China, visit his family. And that was perfectly permissible under the treaty that existed between the United States and China at the time. That is, even though new Chinese laborers were not allowed to come into the country under the Chinese exclusion laws, people who had lived here lawfully prior to the enactment of those laws were entitled to travel outside of the country and to return. But in order to do that, they had to have what was called a certificate of identity, identifying them as lawful residents of the United States. Now, in the one case, which was called Chai Che-ping versus the United States, sometimes referred to the Chinese exclusion law, Chinese exclusion case, Mr. Chai decided that he was going back to visit his family, and he had in his possession a certificate which entitled him to travel back to China and to return to the United States. And when he landed in San Francisco, he presented that certificate of identity and asked to be allowed to enter the country, but he was refused entry into the country. And the reason he was refused entry was that while he was gone, Congress enacted a law which simply invalidated all of those certificates of identity for purposes of returning to the United States. Sort of as if today, it's sort of equivalent to today's green cards. You can imagine if someone takes a trip out of the country and while they were gone, those green cards are entitle someone to return to this country, but while that person is gone, suddenly the Congress says, sorry, those cards are no longer good for return to the U.S. So Mr. Chai filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus here in this particular district court right here. It's kind of interesting because nobody questioned his right to file a habeas petition. Subsequent, in more recent times, there's a lot of issues about whether people, not only immigrants, are entitled to file petitions for writs of habeas corpus. But in those days, no one questioned his right to do that. Unfortunately, the result was not to his liking. And that is, the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court heard this case, they concluded that the enactment by Congress which invalidated those certificates of identity was perfectly legitimate, in that even though it was inconsistent with the treaty that existed, the court said, well, a later enactment by Congress of a statute overtakes or overrules basically a treaty which is inconsistent with it. But then they went on to point out that the right of Congress to determine who can enter this country was an almost absolute right, sort of a right of national sovereignty, that the United States as a sovereign nation can determine which non-citizens can come to the United States. And so they upheld the law and excluded Mr. Chai Che-ping from the United States as a result. The second case was a bit different because it did not involve a Chinese man who had left the United States. He was living here, and Congress passed another law. They weren't satisfied basically with excluding people who had gone out of the country, but passed a law which said that all Chinese persons living in the United States, that is, who were immigrants, not U.S. citizens, of course, had to get a new certificate of residence establishing that they were lawfully present in the U.S. And in order to do that, they had to do it on the basis of the testimony of, as the law provided, one credible white witness. Could not just, sort of like what Judge Lowe was talking about, Chinese people were not allowed to be witnesses in court proceedings, and the same thing was true under this particular statute. The case was called Fong Yu Ting versus the United States, and like Mr. Chai, he also filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus challenging this particular statute. But the Supreme Court said essentially that while in the initial case we were dealing with the power of Congress to exclude people from the U.S., now we were talking about the power of Congress to deport people who were already here, to expel people from the U.S. And the court simply said, well, the power to exclude people and the power to deport people come from the same sense of national sovereignty. We can decide who can stay and we can decide who leave. When Congress makes that decision, simply a decision as to who may remain in the United States. Sort of think of it as the Archie Bunker syndrome in a way. You know, Archie was a bigot, but in his house he could invite people in that he wanted and ask people that he didn't want to leave. And that was the same sort of idea that the Supreme Court went along with in those days. Well, there were a lot of consequences to that plenary power doctrine over the years, right up until the present time, for immigrants, not only Chinese people, but all immigrants, because as a result of those two cases, Congress, the law allowed, first of all, it sanctioned out-and-out discrimination based upon race and nationality to the Chinese people, of course, who were involved in those particular cases, and other Chinese who were living here. But it also led to a system of immigration that was known as the national origin system, which allowed people to enter the United States on the basis of their national origin, basis of their nationality. It included something, you may have forgotten about it, Bill, but it was something called the Asia-Pacific Triangle, which provided that it was in the statute itself was a line drawn right down on the map of Asia, and including a number of the Pacific Islands, and provided that people who were born outside of that area, that is, people who were born in other countries who could have immigrated easily, were subject to a quota based on that particular Asia-Pacific Triangle of only 100 a year, if at least one half of their ancestry could be attributed to lands within that particular triangle. Remember, one of the first clients I had when I started practicing law was a young man from Canada. And under the law at the time, Canadians could immigrate freely. But his father had been born in Japan, and so he was excluded from the U.S. and he was not able to enter the country until Congress amended the law in 1965 and did away with that national origin system.